One morning I walked out to my ranch barn and froze. Spray paint covered the wooden walls in neon colors, my tools were scattered and the doors were hanging off their hinges. My grandfather built that barn with his bare hands, and now it looked like a crime scene. The culprit, not random vandals, but the teenage son of the one woman who already made life miserable, HOA Karen. When I confronted her, she smirked and said boys will be boys before threatening to fine me for having a messy property. That's when I decided Karen was about to learn the hard way, that I wasn't just a rancher with a barn. I had more power than her clipboard could ever touch. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. When I walked into that barn, the smell of fresh paint hit me like a punch in the nose. Acrid sharp, clinging to the wood like poison. My boots crunched on shattered glass, a lantern I'd had for 20 years smashed to pieces. The stalls where my horses usually stood were empty. They had bolted when the chaos erupted. My workbench, once neatly lined with tools, looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Hammers scattered nails dumped in the dirt saws buried under hay. This wasn't just some prank. This was destruction with intention, and I knew exactly whose hand guided it. You see, HOA Karen's son, a lanky teenager with a smug smirk that mirrored his mother's, had been hanging around the ranch lately. I'd caught him a week earlier trying to spray a "No Cows All Load" sign on my fence. I gave him a warning, then thinking maybe he was just a restless kid. But this was no restless moment. This was vandalism, plain and simple. I stormed up to Karen's house just a few streets over. The woman was already on her porch, sipping her green smoothie like she was queen of the subdivision. When I told her what her son had done, she didn't even flinch. She laughed. A sharp, grating sound that made the hair on my arms rise. "Oh, please," she said, waving her hand. "Boys will be boys. Maybe if your property didn't look so rustic, they wouldn't feel the need to make it more exciting." I clenched my jaw so hard I thought my teeth would crack. "Your son destroyed family property," I said. "That barn's been here longer than your whole HOA. You're gonna pay for the damages." But instead of apologizing, she tilted her head, narrowed her eyes, and pulled out that cursed clipboard she always carried. "Actually," she purred, "you're in violation of several HOA codes. That barn is too tall for current regulations, your fencing isn't painted within the approved color palette, and frankly, the smell of animals carries into the neighborhood. I could fine you for all of this." The sheer audacity left me speechless for a moment. She had just turned her son's crime into a weapon against me. I could have exploded right there. But I didn't. Because here's the thing, anger is like wildfire. It feels good to spark it, but it burns out fast and you're left with ashes. I wanted something better, something lasting. I went back to my barn, picked up a brush, and started scrubbing at the paint. My hands shook with fury. Every stroke reminded me of Karen's smirk, her son's sneer, the way the community seemed to tiptoe around her. Neighbors whispered, but no one ever stood up to her. She'd been ruling the HOA like a petty dictator for years, slapping fines on people for leaving trash cans out 5 minutes late, demanding everyone plant the same flowers in their yard, even ordering someone to repaint their shutters because she didn't like the shade of blue. Her son was just a reflection of her arrogance, entitled "Reckless, convinced the world had no consequences." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about paint on wood or broken tools. This was about principle. This was about showing Karen and her brat that they couldn't stomp on people forever. I started asking around the neighborhood quietly like a detective piecing together a crime, and boy, the stories poured out. Her son had egged a neighbor's garage, keyed another's truck, and even let the air out of tires for fun. People had evidence, photos, videos, but they were too scared to confront her. She was infamous for suing anyone who crossed her. I listened, nodded, and tucked all the stories away in my mind. One evening, while patching up the barn door, I saw Karen's son swagger by on his bike, earbuds and blasting music loud enough to scare the cattle again. He stopped just long enough to flip me off and yell, "Nice barn loser," before pedaling off. I laughed. Yes, I laughed. Because at that point I had already decided. This kid's arrogance wasn't just going to cost him a weekend grounding or a slap on the wrist. No, this was going to cost him his future. You see, I wasn't just some rancher. People assumed I lived out here with my cows and horses because that's all I was. But behind the flannel shirts and dusty boots, I had something Karen didn't know about: influence, connections, power, and I knew exactly where to aim it. Because her son might have vandalized my barn, but his biggest weakness was still sitting in a place I knew I could reach: his school. And that's where this story really starts to turn. If there's one thing about Karen, it's that she doesn't know how to leave well enough alone. Some people cause trouble once and then back off when they realize they've gone too far. Not her. No, Karen thrives on pushing boundaries, and when she feels like she's won, she digs in deeper like a tick you can't pry loose. The morning after I confronted her about the vandalism, I found a bright orange HOA violation notice tacked to my mailbox. It flapped in the wind like a taunt. Non-compliant fencing. Excessive noise. Barn structure too rustic. The woman had listed half a dozen so-called infractions, most of which were laughable. Too rustic. What does that even mean? The barn had been standing there for nearly a century, but that's how she operated. She made up the rules as she went, bending them to her will and scaring people into submission. I wasn't surprised, though. This was Karen's signature move. Take the heat off her son by turning the spotlight on someone else. In this case, me. When I walked into the next HOA meeting, it felt like stepping into a courtroom where Karen played both judge and jury. She sat at the head of the table, that smug smile plastered on her face, while the other board members avoided eye contact, clearly intimidated. "Mr. Rancher," she said, practically dripping with false sweetness, "we've received multiple complaints about your property. Neighbors are concerned that the barn is an eyesore and that your livestock are disturbing the peace. I'm afraid we'll need to levy fines until these matters are addressed." I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. Funny, I said, because last I checked, I wasn't the one egging garages or spray painting barns in the middle of the night. Maybe the board should focus on actual crimes instead of made-up ones. Her face flushed, and for a moment the mask cracked. But then she quickly recovered, flashing that fake smile again. Children make mistakes, but homeowners, well, they should know better. That was the moment I realized Karen wasn't just defending her son out of pride. She genuinely believed they were untouchable, and that made her dangerous. As the meeting droned on, neighbors whispered to each other, shooting me sympathetic glances, but not daring to speak up. I could see it in their eyes, though. They were tired. Tired of being bullied, tired of paying fines for ridiculous things, tired of Karen's reign. But fear is a powerful thing, and Karen wielded it like a sword. Later that week, the harassment escalated. Another notice appeared, this one citing me for improper paint colors on my barn. It was the same faded red it had been since my grandfather built it, but apparently red wasn't on Karen's approved palette anymore. 2 days later, a complaint arrived, claiming the odor of manure was drifting into neighboring yards, on a ranch. Imagine that. I'll admit it started to wear on me. Every time I thought I was making progress fixing up the barn, another letter came in, another threat of fines. But instead of breaking me down, it sharpened my focus. And then there was her son. That boy was a carbon copy of his mother, reckless, arrogant, and convinced rules didn't apply to him. One evening, I caught him riding his dirt bike across my pasture, spooking the cattle so badly one nearly broke through the fence. When I shouted at him to stop, he just revved the engine louder and tore off laughing like a maniac. Another time, he spread rumors at school that I kept illegal animals on my property. Word got back to me through a neighbor whose kid attended the same school. Apparently, he was bragging that his mom could shut down the ranch anytime she wanted. That's when I started thinking bigger. See, most people only see what's in front of them. They react to what Karen dishes out and hope she doesn't come back for seconds. But me, I've never been much for playing defense. If you want to beat someone like Karen, you can't just fight back. You have to outthink her, outmaneuver her, hit her where she never sees it coming. So, while she buried me in violation notices and fines, I started asking questions. About her son, about the school he attended. Turns out he went to a private academy a few miles away, one that was known for being strict but also financially unstable. Enrollment was down, costs were up, and there were whispers of budget cuts. That's when the pieces started clicking into place. It wasn't enough to catch Karen in her lies or prove her son was a delinquent. That would only embarrass her for a moment. I wanted something permanent, something that would shake her entire foundation. And what better way than to go after the thing she valued most, her son's reputation and future? Because let's be honest, Karen's entire identity revolved around that kid. She bragged about his potential at every meeting, plastered his face all over HOA newsletters, and acted like he was destined for greatness. If I could prove that wasn't the case, her empire of arrogance would crumble. The thought made me smile as I stacked another bale of hay, my hands steady now. The barn could be rebuilt, the paint could be scrubbed off, but the plan forming in my mind, that was far more satisfying than any repair work. So I kept my cool, played the role of the harassed homeowner, and let Karen think she was winning. Every notice she slapped on my door, every fine she threatened, every insult her son hurled only fueled the fire. Because she didn't realize it yet, but I wasn't just defending my ranch anymore. I was building a case, preparing for a strike she'd never see coming. And when it landed, it wouldn't just sting, it would destroy. People in my neighborhood thought they knew me. To them, I was just the ranch guy, the man who wore dusty boots, patched fences, and spent most of his time feeding cattle. And you know what? I let them believe it. There's a certain power in being underestimated. People lower their guard when they think you're harmless. Karen, more than anyone, had bought into that illusion. She saw me as some country bumpkin who could be bullied with violation notices and empty threats. But what Karen didn't know was that ranching wasn't my only business. Years ago, long before I moved into this community, I'd built a career in real estate and investments. It started small, buying a few rundown properties, flipping them, renting them out. But over time, I expanded into larger projects, shopping centers, apartment complexes, even a couple of industrial parks. Eventually, I diversified into private education. Schools, academies, vocational institutes, places where parents like Karen paid top dollar to put their kids. By the time I settled on this ranch, I was semi-retired, with more money than I'd ever need, and a portfolio that quietly touched corners of the town most people didn't realize. And as fate would have it, Karen's son's school was one of those corners. One evening, after patching the barn roof, I sat down in my office, not the one with hay and horseshoes, but the one inside my house with polished oak shelves and files neatly organized in leather binders. I pulled up the school's financial records. My company had a small investment in it already, just enough to keep an eye on things. But the deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. The academy was struggling. Enrollment was down by nearly 20%. Teachers were leaving because salaries were being delayed. The board was desperate for funding to keep the lights on. For most investors, that would have been a red flag. For me, it was an opportunity. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, and couldn't help but chuckle. Karen thought she had power because she could fine people $20 for a trash can left on the curb. Meanwhile, I was staring at the chance to own the very place that dictated her son's future. The idea started as a spark, but the more I thought about it, the brighter it burned. What if I didn't just defend myself against her attacks? What if I went on offense, not with fists, not with shouting, but with the kind of authority Karen could never fight? The thought of walking into her world and pulling the rug out from under her was too tempting to ignore. But I needed to be careful. Karen was bold, but she wasn't stupid. If she caught wind of my plan, she'd do everything in her power to sabotage it. So I played the part. I showed up at the next HOA meeting wearing my old ranch jacket, looking tired and frustrated. She mocked me again, waving another violation notice in my face about non-approved barn paint. The neighbors laughed nervously, too scared to say anything. I just smiled, nodded, and walked out. What she didn't know was that earlier that morning, I'd signed the first set of papers to increase my investment in her son's school. The process took weeks, but I didn't mind. Every violation she mailed me, every smirk she tossed my way, only made me more patient. I knew the day was coming when her clipboard and petty fines would mean nothing compared to the authority I'd soon hold. Meanwhile, I kept gathering evidence on her son. I didn't have to look far. Teachers whispered about his behavior in class: disruptive, disrespectful, even threatening. Parents complained he bullied younger kids. The graffiti he left on my barn wasn't his first offense. The school had already dealt with several vandalism incidents, but every time Karen stormed in, threatened lawsuits, and got the charges dropped. She was protecting him, shielding him, enabling him. But once I owned the school, that shield would vanish. I remember one particular night. I was sitting on my porch, the sun setting over the pasture, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Karen's son rode by on his dirt bike again, tearing up the gravel road, laughing like a hyena. He slowed just enough to shout, "Hope your barn falls down, loser," before speeding off. I didn't get angry this time. I just sipped my coffee calm as a man who already knows the ending of the story. "Enjoy it while you can, kid," I muttered. "Your world's about to change." Within a month, my lawyers finalized the acquisition. Through my investment firm, I became the majority shareholder of the private academy. That gave me authority over budget decisions, staff hires, and most importantly, disciplinary action. It was almost poetic. Karen had spent years lording her HOA authority over me, acting like her clipboard was a crown, and now I had quietly positioned myself as the king of the very castle her son depended on. The next time she wagged a finger at me about rustic barns and HOA violations, I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing in her face, because she thought she was winning. But in reality, she was standing on a cliff, and I was the one holding the ground beneath her feet. And soon I'd let it crumble. You ever hear the phrase, "Revenge is a dish best served cold"? Well, I don't know about cold, but I can tell you this: it's best served patiently. And patience is something ranchers have in spades. You don't raise cattle or plant fields without learning how to wait. Karen thought she had me cornered. Every week, another violation showed up in my mailbox. My barn roof was improperly angled. My horses were visible from the road. At one point, she even wrote me up for unapproved gravel in my driveway. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I paid the small fines, nodded, and went back to fixing fences. But behind closed doors, I was orchestrating something far bigger than she could ever imagine. The first step was paperwork. Lots of it. Buying control of a school isn't like buying a bag of feed. It meant contracts, signatures, negotiations. My lawyers worked quietly, moving pieces around the board while I played dumb in public. Karen bragged to neighbors that she was teaching me a lesson, and they chuckled nervously, too afraid to admit they secretly hated her guts. Meanwhile, I was preparing for the moment when the tables would turn. One night after a long day repairing the barn, I spread out documents across my kitchen table. Legal papers, financial statements, school board minutes, all of it stacked in neat piles. I signed my name on the last contract, the ink glistening under the lamplight, and leaned back with a grin. The school was mine. Well, mine through my investment firm, but let's not split hairs. I was now the majority owner of the academy Karen's son attended. The timing couldn't have been better. Just days later, I received word from the headmaster that Karen's son had been caught red-handed, vandalizing the school gym spray paint again, the same sloppy neon letters that had defiled my barn. The evidence was undeniable. Photos, witnesses, even a video from another student. But true to form, Karen stormed into the school, wagging her finger, threatening lawsuits, and demanding everyone look the other way. She didn't know that her threats had lost their bite, because now the final say didn't belong to the headmaster. It belonged to me. I kept quiet, though. Timing, remember, timing is everything. At the next HOA meeting, Karen turned up the theatrics. She called me a poor cowboy with no sense of community pride, and even suggested my barn should be torn down entirely. Her son, sitting in the back of the room, smirked at me like he'd already won. I smiled. I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue. I just let her rant, let her neighbors squirm in their chairs, and walked out with my head held high. The trap was set, and Karen had no clue she was already caught in it. The very next week, I arranged a school board meeting. Officially, it was about budget restructuring. Unofficially, it was about putting an end to Karen's nonsense once and for all. Walking into that boardroom felt different. Not like the HOA meetings where I was the punching bag. No, here I was in control. My name was on the contracts, my voice carried weight, and for the first time in this whole ordeal, Karen was walking into my territory. I'll never forget the look on her face when she barged into the meeting, red blazer flashing like a warning light, her son slouched behind her. She launched into her usual tirade, demanding the school drop all charges against him, insisting he was just a spirited boy who didn't deserve punishment. Teachers tried to calm her down, parents whispered in the corner, but she kept shouting over everyone louder and louder. I sat there quietly, letting her dig her own grave, until finally the room went silent as I stood up. "Karen," I said, my voice steady, calm. "Do you know who you're talking to?" She blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I'm talking to a board that will do the right thing, or else—" I cut her off. "You're talking to the majority owner of this school, which means you're talking to the man who gets the final say." You could have heard a pin drop. Her mouth opened, then closed again like a fish out of water. Her son sat up straighter, eyes wide. The other board members nodded, slowly confirming what I'd just said. Karen's face turned a shade of crimson. "I didn't think humanly possible. You can't do that," she sputtered. "You're just some rancher." I leaned forward, smiling just enough to let her know I wasn't bluffing. "I'm more than that. And your clipboard doesn't mean a damn thing in here." The silence that followed was glorious. For the first time, Karen wasn't in control. She wasn't the queen bee. She was just another parent with no power staring down the man she thought she could crush. And in that moment, I knew the real fun was about to begin. Because revenge wasn't about yelling at an HOA meeting or throwing her kid off my property. No, revenge was about patience, precision, and power. And I had all three. Karen didn't know it yet, but her son's days at that academy were numbered. And once he was gone, so was her illusion of control. The day of the school board confrontation was one of those mornings where the air felt heavier, like even the weather knew something big was about to go down. I put on a clean shirt, not the flannel I usually wore around the ranch, but a crisp button-down and a blazer. Still had the boots, though. Always the boots. They kept me grounded. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in the academy's auditorium. By the time I arrived, the place was buzzing. Teachers filled the first few rows, parents milled around clutching folders of complaints, and students loitered near the back whispering rumors. Karen was already there, pacing like a general about to lead an army into battle. Her son slouched beside her, earbuds, dangling hoodie pulled low, trying to look tough but clearly nervous. When I walked in, a hush fell over the room. People knew me as the rancher. They didn't know me as the man who had just bought their school. Karen didn't waste a second. The moment she saw me, she pounced. "There he is," she shouted, pointing as if I were a criminal. The man harassing my family, spreading lies about my son and trying to turn this community against us. He has no business being here. The headmaster cleared his throat. Actually, Mrs. Karen, he does. Mr. Rancher now holds majority ownership of this academy. His presence is not only permitted, it's required. The words hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Gasps, murmurs, heads swiveling toward me. Karen's face froze in shock for a split second before twisting into rage. "This is a farce," she screeched. "He's a rancher. He shovels manure for a living. He doesn't know the first thing about education." I let her rant. It was the same playbook she used at every HOA meeting: yell louder than everyone else, intimidate with threats, and hope people cave. But this wasn't the HOA. This was my boardroom now. Finally, when the noise settled, I stood, calm, controlled, the way a man does when he knows the cards are stacked in his favor. "Karen," I said evenly, "this isn't about me. This is about your son. And tonight we're not here to talk about barns or fences. We're here to talk about the evidence." I nodded to one of the teachers, who nervously stepped forward with a projector remote. The lights dimmed, and suddenly the screen behind us lit up with images. The first was my barn covered in neon spray paint. Gasps rippled through the room. The second was the school gym vandalized with the same sloppy letters. Then came security footage. Karen's son caught red-handed laughing as he sprayed graffiti, his face lit by the camera. The boy sank lower in his seat, his tough act crumbling. "Lies," Karen shouted, standing so quickly her chair toppled. "Doctored footage. This is a smear campaign against my family." Another teacher spoke up, voice trembling but steady. "Mrs. Karen, we caught him ourselves. Several staff witnessed it. He also harassed students, bullied classmates, and disrupted lessons. We've been documenting everything." She rounded on the teacher finger, stabbing the air. "You'll regret this. I'll sue every one of you for slander." And that was when I delivered the line I'd been waiting for. "You can't sue the truth, Karen." The room went silent. Her face went pale, then flushed red. For the first time, she looked unsure, vulnerable. I walked slowly toward the front of the room, each step echoing. "For years, you've bullied this community with your clipboard and empty threats. You've taught your son that rules don't apply to him, that he can do whatever he wants because mommy will bail him out. But here's the thing." I paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Neighbors, teachers, parents, all staring, hanging on my words. Actions have consequences. And tonight, those consequences come due. Her son finally spoke, his voice cracking. "Mom, Quiet," she snapped at him, desperate to keep control. But it was too late. The tide had turned. I turned to the board. The evidence is clear. Multiple acts of vandalism, bullying, disruption. This isn't a case of boys will be boys. This is a pattern of behavior that endangers the school community. As majority owner, I call for a disciplinary hearing to decide his future here. The board members nodded one by one. Some looked relieved, others determined. Even the headmaster, who had endured Karen's wrath countless times before, looked like a man finally breathing free air. Karen tried one last tactic: tears. She clutched her pearls, voice trembling. "Please, this is my son we're talking about. He's all I have. Don't ruin his future over childish mistakes." I met her eyes, steady and unflinching. "He ruined his own future the moment he thought he was untouchable. The best thing you could have done as a mother was teach him accountability. Instead, you taught him arrogance. That ends here." The crowd erupted into whispers. Some nodded, some wiped tears. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid of Karen. They were watching her crumble. I sat back down, folding my hands calmly. "The hearing will be scheduled immediately. Until then, he's suspended." The gavel struck. Decision made. Karen's scream echoed through the auditorium, raw and furious, but it didn't matter anymore. The power she'd clung to all these years had slipped through her fingers, replaced by the cold reality that she couldn't control me, the board, or the truth. And as her son buried his face in his hands, the weight of it all crashing down, I knew one thing for certain: this battle wasn't over yet. The real blow was still to come. The disciplinary hearing was set for the following week, and by then, the entire town seemed to know about it. Word spread like wildfire. Karen's son, the boy who strutted through school with his hoodie pulled low and a smirk on his face, was finally being called out. Parents whispered in grocery store aisles. Neighbors gossiped on front porches. Even the ranch hands who helped me mend fences grinned when they mentioned it. Everyone knew this wasn't just about one boy, it was about finally standing up to his mother. The auditorium was packed that evening. Teachers filed and parents clutched notebooks of complaints. Students whispered excitedly in the back rows. It felt less like a hearing and more like a trial, the kind people would remember for years. And sitting at the center of it all, wearing that infamous red blazer like armor, was Karen. Her son sat beside her, slouched and sullen, tapping his foot against the floor, as if the rhythm could drown out reality. I took my seat at the head of the board papers, neatly stacked in front of me. But I didn't need them. Every detail was already burned into my mind. The headmaster opened the proceedings, voice shaking slightly. "We are here to review the conduct of student." He barely got the name out before Karen interrupted. "This is outrageous," she snapped, rising to her feet. "My son doesn't deserve to be treated like a criminal. He's a good boy who's been targeted by jealous neighbors and spiteful teachers. This entire hearing is nothing but a witch hunt." The room stirred, but I raised a hand and the murmurs died down. "Mrs. Karen, you'll have your chance to speak. But first we're going to hear from the teachers, the parents, and the students your son has harmed." And one by one, they came forward. A math teacher, trembling slightly, described how her lessons were constantly interrupted by mocking laughter and loud outbursts. A younger student, no more than 12, clutched her mother's hand as she explained how Karen's son cornered her in the hallway, taunting her until she cried. A custodian showed photos of the gym walls still stained from spray paint. Each testimony was like a nail in the coffin. Karen's face shifted from rage to disbelief, then to desperation. "They're lying," she screamed. "Every single one of them. This is a conspiracy against us." I leaned forward, my voice steady but firm. "Conspiracies don't come with photographs, Karen, or security footage, or half a dozen eyewitnesses." The final piece of evidence was presented: a video from a student's phone showing her son vandalizing the school property while bragging that mom will make it go away. The words echoed through the auditorium, damning in their arrogance. Her son buried his face in his hoodie, and for the first time he looked ashamed. Karen, however, doubled down. She stormed toward the board table, slamming her palms down so hard the microphones rattled. "You can't do this. You don't have the authority." I met her glare calmly. "Actually, I do. As majority owner of this academy, the board and I have every right to decide what happens next. And right now we're voting." The teachers and board members exchanged glances, then nodded. Hands were raised. One by one the votes came in. Expulsion, expulsion, expulsion. Every single voice rang against Karen like a hammer blow. Her scream tore through the room. "No, you can't expel him. He's my son. He deserves a future." I stood, gathering the papers, slowly, deliberately. "Every child deserves a future, Karen. But your son chose to destroy his own chances by believing rules didn't apply to him. And you," I paused, locking eyes with her, "you chose to enable him every step of the way." She staggered back as if the words themselves were physical blows. Her son looked at her, then anger flashing in his eyes. "You said they couldn't touch me," he muttered bitterly. "You said you'd fix it like you always do." For once, Karen had no answer. The gavel struck. Effective immediately, the headmaster announced this student is permanently expelled from the academy. The crowd erupted, not in jeers, not in cheers, but in a collective sigh of relief. Teachers hugged each other, parents whispered finally, and even the students looked stunned as if they'd just seen the fall of a tyrant. Karen, however, collapsed into her chair, pale and shaking. The clipboard she carried everywhere slid from her lap, clattering against the floor. For years, that clipboard had been her weapon, her crown, her symbol of power. Now it lay useless at her feet. I walked past her on my way out, pausing just long enough to deliver the final line. "Karen, this isn't revenge. This is accountability. And sometimes accountability hurts." She didn't look up. Her son just stared at the floor, silent. As I stepped outside, into the cool night air, neighbors patted me on the back, teachers thanked me, and parents shook my hand. But I didn't smile, not yet, because this wasn't about victory or gloating. It was about balance, about finally tipping the scales back toward justice. And as I climbed into my truck, I glanced back at the school, its lights glowing in the darkness. The battle was over, but the story wasn't finished, because when someone like Karen loses power, they don't go quietly. But for the first time in a long time, I knew this. She was no longer untouchable. The weeks after, the expulsion felt different, lighter somehow. For years, Karen's shadow had hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud, and suddenly the skies were clearing. It didn't happen overnight, of course. Karen tried everything she could to claw back her power. She marched into another HOA meeting demanding emergency sessions, shouting about illegal board takeovers and corrupt schools. But the fire was gone from her words. People weren't afraid anymore. Neighbors who once stayed silent now spoke up. One man calmly stood and asked why Karen's own driveway still violated HOA codes she enforced so harshly on others. A woman demanded an audit of HOA funds, pointing out mysterious expenses linked to Karen's pet projects. For the first time, Karen was on the defensive. Her son, meanwhile, disappeared from the spotlight. Without the academy to prop him up, he slunk through the neighborhood like a ghost. The kid who once shouted insults at my ranch now couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The smirk was gone, replaced by shame. And while part of me felt satisfaction seeing that arrogance crumble, another part of me, the part that had raised children of my own, felt a flicker of pity. Maybe, just maybe, this was the wake-up call he needed. One evening, as I was mending the last of the vandalized barn walls, a group of neighbors stopped by. They brought pie, coffee, even a couple of six-packs. Simple gestures, but meaningful. One of them said quietly, "You didn't just save your ranch. You saved all of us." I smiled, wiping the sawdust from my hands. I didn't save anyone. I just reminded Karen that no one is above consequences. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. This wasn't just about Karen or her son. It was about a community that had been bullied into silence, finally finding its voice again. The barn, once a symbol of vandalism and loss, became something else entirely. Neighbors volunteered to help rebuild it. Kids from the school, those who'd once been bullied by Karen's son, painted murals on the inside walls, bright colors full of hope. What was once a target became a monument to resilience. And Karen, she faded. Slowly but surely. She still lived in the neighborhood, still clutched her clipboard, but it didn't have the same bite. People ignored her, notices laughed off her threats, and when she tried to fine a neighbor for planting daisies instead of roses, the entire HOA board voted against her. Without her son's future to brag about, her voice carried no weight. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy the irony. But the real victory wasn't seeing her fall, it was watching the neighborhood rise. Kids rode their bikes without fear of harassment. Parents planted what they wanted in their yards. And I got back to ranching, the simple work I loved, with a barn that stood stronger than before. One night I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunset paint the sky gold. My horses grazed quietly in the pasture, and for the first time in years the air felt peaceful. No more violation notices. No more smirks from a spoiled teenager. Just quiet, honest life. I thought back to that morning when I first saw the barn destroyed. Back then I'd felt powerless. But power isn't always about who shouts the loudest or waves the biggest clipboard. Real power comes from patience, strategy, and the courage to stand firm when it matters. Karen never understood that. But I did. And that's why in the end she lost. If there's one lesson I want you to take from this story, it's this: true strength isn't about how hard you can hit back, it's about how smart you choose to fight. When someone wrongs us, our first instinct is often to lash out, to yell, to demand immediate justice. But sometimes the most powerful response is patience. To step back, breathe, and look for the move they'll never see coming. Karen thought she was untouchable because she bullied people into silence. But silence doesn't mean weakness, it can mean planning. It can mean waiting for the right moment. And when that moment comes, the results speak louder than any argument ever could. In life, you'll meet people like Karen, arrogant, entitled, convinced the rules don't apply to them. Don't let them drag you down to their level. Stand tall, play the long game, and let time reveal the truth. At the end of the day, justice isn't about revenge, it's about restoring balance. And that's exactly what happened here. So now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a Karen in your life, someone who pushed and pushed until you finally had enough? Drop your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this tale of HOA drama and sweet justice, make sure to hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. Because in this neighborhood, the stories never end.